My name's Jeff Home, but before I get started, I wanted to say again, to reiterate what Matt's just said, thank you very much to Lara and to Matt and to those at EW who have helped make this happen. I guess I want a big thank you to the Ministry of Startups. It's a pretty cool space that we've got here, and I think you'll agree it's a location I think we want to keep coming back to. So thank you very much for Ministry of Startups. Appreciate it. So not that I wanted to start it on a down note or anything, but I'm not really very good at this kind of thing, so I might need to get some assistance from the audience for things like switching tabs and stuff like that. So be nice with me. A nostalgic look back at 25 years of the internet. So yep, I'm there, Jeff Home. I'm a web dev. I work with Energized Work, and I'm a little bit older than some of you here. I went to university in New Zealand in the late 80s, and I evangelized for Apple in HyperCard in the early 90s, and I started building websites sort of in the mid 90s, and I've been contracting here in London since the late 90s. So that's kind of my thing.
Listen, I know HyperCard.
We're going to talk after this. HyperCard's really cool, and it gets a little mention later on in one of my slides. So we get some fun here. There's no Twitter handle for me. There's no Facebook link for me. There's no LinkedIn for me. You could say I'm a bit too old for these things. So what is the internet? I was going to ask people what the internet was, but I hate it when people do that in these sort of presentations. So I'm not going to ask you what the internet is. I'm going to tell you what Wikipedia thinks the internet is all about. I think a lot of people nowadays, I don't know the word millennials, but people who aren't as old as me, they probably think the internet is just the web. The internet is Google, and if you talk to my stepmom, the internet, she just looks at me like I'm an idiot. So the internet, the way that the purists will look at it, the internet is just a way of connecting computers together to get access to information. At least in my headspace, that's what the internet is. And that's kind of cool because that's what I wanted to talk about. So the internet continues to be things like FTP, file transfer protocol. There's some engineers here. We all know what FTP is. Do we all know what FTP is?
Yeah.
I really hope so.
Not everybody's an engineer.
Do you get an idea as to how old FTP might just be? Really old. 1971, almost as old as me. It's been updated a few times since then. But FTP, file transfer protocol, is all about sending and retrieving files from computer to computer. I mean, ultimately that's what it is. You can do lots of other stuff too now, but that's what it's all about. Most modern browsers today, by the way, they're supporting FTP, and that's an important point. Archie. I don't know how many people have you ever heard of Archie, except for Gus, who's probably heard of everything that's coming up on my slide deck. Archie was an FTP indexing tool. I say was, it's actually still running, which is kind of mad. Started off really early on in the 91 sort of time, where a couple of students wanted to have this idea of, they knew that there was all this information out there on the FTPs. They didn't know how they were going to find this information, and this begins my narrative of search. So Archie was all about indexing or getting lists of files that they could somehow search later on. It's quite simple, and they even thought about stuff like network resources, and so they had a list of FTP sites that they would visit no more frequently than once a month because they had to keep that bandwidth down. Bandwidth is quite important. So they'd visit these FTP sites, they'd request a list of all of the files that are there, and all FTP sites offer this option. They'd download the information and store it locally, go to the next site, next site, next site. And then there'd be a telnet interface, nice text-based, no nice point-and-click stuff, text-based interface, allowing you to query where is this file, where's the closest FTP site that I can download this file from. Later versions of it came along where one Archie server can talk to another Archie server, and it can get all the work that Archie server's done. And so it's leveraging, the bigger the network, of course, the better the connectivity. And this, very, very similar to what we've got right now with pretty much all of our distributed architecture. But my point being that it's actually still in use today. NNTP, Usenet, heard of Usenet? Yeah, some people have heard of Usenet. Internet groups, news. I'm not going to dwell on this too much because I've got loads of cards, loads of slides, and not so much time. But news groups were kind of something that I think probably a lot of people in the early 90s, maybe the late 80s, who were using Unix boxes, who were using mainframe systems, that was probably in many ways, other than email, probably their first chance to have a look at what was available on this internet, and their very first chance to explore other people's opinions, chats, those sorts of things. I don't know whether any of you have got some interesting Usenet group names that aren't unsafe for work to report.
I started out using Trojan.
Yeah? Thank you. NNTP put together in 1986, still in use today. IRC, Internet Relay Chat, Slack. You've probably heard of Slack, right? All built on IRC. You can slap people with trouts and stuff like that. 1988, IRC was put together, and it was actually initially an attempt to extend a bulletin board over at Finnish university called Oulu, O-U-L-U University in Finland. They wanted to extend a bulletin board system to gain access to, I think it was initially the BitNet relay, but they wanted to have the ability to chat, to communicate, maybe more real time than just sending a message and waiting for someone to respond to the message. So EFNet, one of the networks of IRC, came about in about early 1990, and then we moved on. We got Undernet came on board in 92. As of 2016, so only last year, Freenode is the largest IRC network still in existence. It's got a whopping 90,000 users. Gopher, it was an early alternative to the web. Didn't really work, obviously, because you're probably all looking at me thinking, what on earth is Gopher? But Gopher offered the ability to, it had a concept of tree navigation. So all information sits on at the bottom as a leaf node. That's where your pages are, if we go look at it from the web side of things. To get to this page, there was invariably a series of steps that you made, a series of menus that you navigated down through categories. It was a great tool for libraries because there's already organized and categorized information. It was developed in 1991. Pretty much every major browser to this day supports Gopher protocol. You just type Gopher : / but then you've got to hunt around trying to find working Gopher services around. But Gopher allowed departments, mostly initially academic departments, to serve really important stuff like departmental phone lists, stuff like that. So the internet was a little bit much more fun than that. We had Coke machine. So this talks about Finger. Gus, tell me about Finger. Okay. You could type. And there was a time I've got it written down here in the mid-70s it was first put together, but there was a time that you could type Finger Coke at CMUA, so that's Carnegie Mellon University. And it would tell you how cold the Cokes were in the Coke fridge and how full the hoppers were, based on how long they'd been in there. They fitted it with a bunch of micro switches and hooked it up to pretty hardcore PDP-10 at the time. And it was really important if you're working somewhere in the computer lab at Carnegie Mellon and you needed that Coke. You didn't want to make sure you were getting the warm Coke, because there's nothing quite like warm Coke. So cold Coke was a big thing. You could finger the online Coke machine, find out the status of it, and then as long as you got down there quickly enough so somebody else hadn't stolen your cold Coke, you'd be in. It doesn't support Apple Pay, if that's what you're asking. It went offline for a while when Coke changed their bottle shapes, but it's okay, because in the early 90s they got a new one in and they retrofitted it, and they also added an M&M machine. Sadly, the M&M machine's not online anymore. A little closer to home, the Trojan Room coffee pot. Anyone ever heard of the Trojan Room coffee pot? It was Cambridge University? Yes. Yeah?
Yeah. When they try to look at the coffee pot to check if something was if there was still coffee inside.
Absolutely right. It was probably, and is credited as being, in my notes anyway, the first implementation of a web camera. Right? It's a 128 pixel by 128 pixel grayscale video camera. That's probably about this big by today's sound. But remember that most modern computers of that era had such large screens as 640 by 480. So in actual fact, 128 by 128 was pretty cool. Initially, they had little desktop app that they would run on their X servers and on their Xboxes and so on, their Xboxes. And this very quickly, with the introduction of this thing that came later, we've not reached it yet, the World Wide Web, allowed them to show it in these things called web browsers. Web browsers haven't been invented yet, so we're not going to go quite down to that route. It went online in the 1993, we're going to find out all about 1993 in a moment. Came online in 1993. And sadly was retired in 2001. The very last picture of the Trojan Room coffee pot machine shows the hand just about to unplug it. And you can still see that one today. So I mentioned 1993. Why is 1993 so special? Well, in 1993, we started to see the fruits of Tim Berners-Lee, our wonderful man that we know and love for putting together some specs for HTML, pretty much defining the World Wide Web, and writing World Wide Web, no spaces. He wrote World Wide Web. World Wide Web is a fantastic web browser, right? He wrote this in 1991 while working at CERN. And because he'd also created this thing called the World Wide Space Web, there was a little bit of confusion going on. So shortly afterwards, World Wide Web was renamed to Nexus. The cool thing about this, though, is that it had both an regular HTML viewing, so regular web page viewing, but it had a WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, GUI, graphical user interface, editor built into it. That, at the time, was pretty cool, and something that wasn't really replicated for about 4 or 5 more years when we started to see Netscape Communicator and the Netscape suite pull out. That was the very first kind of what we consider now to be the web browsers, and shortly after, some other memorable web browsers turned up. I wanted to mention only two. I mean, there are lots of them, but these are what we refer to as pioneering browsers, so they're not in existence anymore, but they broke some really important ground. And the first one I want to talk about is Viola WWW. Released in 1982, it was the first to have inline graphics. You could have a picture with some text beside it. That was very important. It was the first to offer scripting, very primitive scripting, and not necessarily in the way that we're familiar with seeing JavaScript and so on there. It supported tables. For those of you like Matt who have spent some time in purgatory doing web development, tables at that time were used almost exclusively for layout. We didn't have all these really cool positional CSS bits and pieces and frameworks. Still today with some. Yeah, and it supported style sheets, or a very early implementation of style sheets too. So in that respect, when we say pioneering, I'm going to say pioneering GUI, graphical user interface web browser, and that was quite important. I mentioned earlier on that I was going to talk about HyperCard again, right here. So this was influenced very strongly by HyperCard. HyperCard was a bit of software that was put together by Bruce Horn, various developers at Apple. If you can imagine, it was an application that ran on the early Macintosh computers. But if you think of the screens that it showed as being modern-day web pages, these screens, they had a mixture of text and graphics. Here we go. They had these links. We called them buttons that you could press on, and you clicked on these links, and they took you to other screens. Can you see how close this is to what we consider now to be a regular internet or a regular web? This is done, however, in a closed proprietary bit of software called HyperCard. My involvement, and I said earlier on, I was working with HyperCard and evangelizing it. I was working on teaching HyperCard to teachers so that they could write creative course material that Apple could then use to leverage sales into schools. All right. Anyone familiar with the Lynx browser? except for Gus. I think Gus still uses the Lynx browser, of course you do, and that's why I added it's still in active use today. The Lynx browser in the early 90s, it didn't hook up to the internet. It was really designed for, again, smaller usage within, say, a university campus to allow dissemination of really important things like departmental phone lists and stuff, right? So they wanted to extend this out a little bit. 1993, some chap decided that would be a grand idea, hooked it up to TCP/IP, put an internet interface on it, and all of a sudden the coolest browser in the universe was generated. It didn't do images, didn't do JavaScript, it didn't do Flash. For the eagle-eyed amongst you, you will of course recognize that that is not a cello. It's, I think it's Dan, is it a mandolin?
No idea.
I think it's a mandolin. Cello was the very first web browser for Windows. Before Microsoft figured out that they could make a hell of a lot of money by creating a web browser of their own, Cello came along, released as shareware in 1993, worked on Windows 3.1. It went out of favor in 1994, so it didn't even really last a year. But for those of you who are still running the most important operating systems, it had full OS/2 support, and it's Windows NT 3.5 as well, so that's quite exciting. Microsoft actually ended up by licensing some of this through, I think they eventually sold this to some legal group. They were going to release version 2 and they didn't manage to release version 2 and it went quiet, and then all of a sudden with Windows 95 Plus, Microsoft released a version of Internet Explorer which had certain parts of this embedded into it. So I want to talk about the Cello browser, but the most important thing, 1993, was Mosaic browser. NCSA Mosaic, to some, now known as Mosaic browser. This is the browser that pretty much created this watershed between what was the internet before and what is the internet now. It introduced to us, the ability to have inline graphics, links that you could click on, all of the features that had previously been put together in these pioneering browsers, which were deprecated after like a year or two. But it supported all of the protocols. It supported FTP, it supported Gopher, it supported this new thing called HTTP, which this guy, Tim Berners-Lee, had been spending a lot of time working on. And after about 2 or 3 years, it had pretty much taken over the internet in terms of a browser side of things. So we had, if you were a webmaster and you were checking your access logs, because you know that's what you do when you're a webmaster, way back in say mid-94, you'd be looking down your list of what browser types have hit my website, and after you've gone through all of the 50% or so of the Mosaic browsers rather, you'll see that it was Cello browser. So your Windows users were using Cello. Pretty much everybody else was using Mosaic. Unix users, Mac users, not Windows users, funny enough, because they didn't have one other than Cello. Mosaic browser also supported NNTP. That was the newsgroup stuff that we had earlier on there as well. And it was the first mainstream browser that supported inline graphics with text. We say it wasn't the first browser because, as we know, we had some earlier prototype browsers that did just that. 1993 was a little bit more important for me because I'd finished university by then, and I was working with Apple, and I'd heard about the early betas of this and been playing around with Mosaic. I was invited by Apple to do a keynote speech, and it was at a university, my old university, with 200 to 300 academics. And my brief was simply to try and engage them, to try to explain to them how much cooler the World Wide Web was than, say, Gopher space, which at the time was gaining a bit of traction, and again, mostly within academia. So I think I was 23 years old, dressed up in board shorts with zinc on my nose, holding this huge surfboard, and I ran down from the back of this auditorium shouting that the surf was up. Now, I get a couple of lame laughs right now, but back then, 200 to 300 academics, you can imagine, silence. So it worked out really well. It wasn't a stand up in front of a computer and present sort of a talk. It was a stand up in front of a computer with an audience and let's make a web page. And I challenge many of you to try to do that to a small audience, let alone in 1993, where we had such challenges as no cool HDMI cables, no cool projectors. So I had an overhead projector, and there was a plate on top that you could project this lovely grayscale, optimized for 640 by 480, onto the projector screen. Didn't have a cool camera, couldn't download a picture off the internet, so I had hooked up to a serial cable, took a photograph of the audience. We spent about 5 minutes waiting for it to copy onto the computer. All that time I was filling space, explaining to them how images are fantastic, and all these academics are going, who cares? Talking to them about how important it was to have semantics, how a heading followed by some text was really cool, and they're just looking at me like I'm an idiot. After 45 odd minutes or so, not just waiting for the picture, but of coaxing from them what different areas they think they might be able to use, well, what they were currently using Gopher for and what they might be able to use the web for. We'd created a pretty cool web page with an H1 heading. We used a table for our layout, so we had a picture on one side and some text there and some text something. Oh, it's all very exciting. So for me, 1993 was the first time that I got a chance to show off the web and to evangelize the web. And I wouldn't say that I've been doing that ever since, but in as much as the internet goes, the internet before 1993 and the internet after 1993 were quite different spaces. So,
Jeff, you've got about 10 minutes, just let you know.
Thank you for that. Here's what an NCSA Mosaic screen might look like. There's some familiar items on here. You've got a submit button, you've got some type-ins. Some of those type-in boxes and so on haven't changed too much. But you can see that that's a pretty crude interface. However, that is what started the whole game. The World Wide Web. Some of our favourite World Wide Web moments, for me at least, Netscape and Internet Explorer. Two browsers that pretty much kicked off the concept of browser wars. Browser wars, well, there have been two major big browser wars as such, but browser wars really just refer to the fight for market share. So originally I was talking about Cello, and I was talking about NCSA Mosaic, or Mosaic as it became. They had the major share at that time. These guys stepped in, and by 1995, Netscape had pretty much edged them right out. And I think by the end of 1995, you wouldn't bother with NCSA Mosaic, you wouldn't bother with Mosaic. In fact, most of the people had already moved on from Mosaic, and they'd moved on to, funny enough, to Netscape. So they were continuing their efforts, but now in a more commercial sense. And then there's this fledgling Internet Explorer bunch of people, and they came out with their first browser in 1994, so just after Cello had decided to retire. Netscape Navigator had a pretty checkered history. We called it Netscape, Netscape Navigator, but Netscape was a company, and it had a product suite. At the time, this was called Netscape Communicator. They had a product suite called Netscape Communicator, and their company was called Netscape Communications. So yeah, they had to rename and rebrand, and there was all sorts of stories about i.e. Microsoft installing a huge big, like 18-foot E, as their logo was at some convention hall, only overnight to have it destroyed by a bunch of Netscape employees who had replaced it with their Mozilla, their big, the Tyrannosaurus Rex Mozilla equivalent. These stories went back and forth, as both those two companies were basically fighting for market share. So Netscape Communicator lasted until about version 4 and around about 1997 or so. During that time, it introduced into pretty much every operating system now the ability to have a WYSIWYG GUI HTML editor built into the browser, which is really cool for us web developers, because we didn't have to use a text editor anymore. We could just do everything inside the browser and then save those files out. was a big deal for me anyway. 2000 came along. Around 2000, Netscape had changed they'd lost. They'd had to open source because Microsoft had won. They'd open sourced their browser. They had no revenue anymore, and they were pretty much just hoping to create portals and services to make money not from sales, not from licensing agreements, but really from creating communities and creating services on the internet. That's kind of a familiar theme. It's going to come up shortly. Netscape renamed to Netscape Navigator, 2000 or so. It sort of petered out by about January 2007. It had kind of gone. We have, I'll move on. Some other icons that might be familiar to you. Opera software. Opera was a pretty cool browser. It still is in existence. It's revolutionary in that it introduced things like tabbed browsing and gestures and other things that are really interesting for those that are really interested in that, but it didn't seem to grasp or grip rather the nation, and Opera has succeeded in just staying at like 3 or 4% nowadays. It's a very, very niche and specialist browser that seems to have spent most of its efforts in licensing now, so kind of out there. But then there's this other thing called Chrome. It'll never catch on. On the left here we've got Firebird. Firebird became, on the right, Firefox. This is, I don't think that this isn't nostalgic for me. It's just of interest, nonetheless. Firefox, a lot of users are still using Firefox browser to this very day. Firefox sits quite closely with Chrome, sits quite closely with Internet Explorer as the three biggies out there right now. Okay, we've got Safari from Apple and so on, but I could mention a million of these things. Hello, is it me you're looking for? Leo Sayer. So, search. Search was a real big deal. Remember right at the very beginning I talked to you about FTP, silos of information that were stored remotely and you didn't know how to find the file that you think you might have wanted. We introduced Archie to allow you to search for some of these files, and then we had Gopher services that layered on top of that, and we had other tools like Veronica and bits and pieces that made all of those, the discovery process, a little bit more straightforward. We didn't really have great search engines. We had some crawlers. We had places that went and they took titles of documents, and some of them took whole text copies of these documents and made them available. But they weren't really good web search engines, and I wanted to talk about some of the attempts that were made to create search solutions for you. And now I am going into the nostalgia side of things. So behold, 1994, the introduction of GeoCities. It's a community designed to be a community web portal. Portal being the key word, and it's a very important thing to mention because so many people in the early to late 90s wanted to become portals. We'll come back to this. This was actually, Screen Grab I think was a little bit later than 1994. I think it's a 1998 one, so sorry for trying to steal that thunder there. It was founded in 94, as you can see. It was acquired, it has a checkered history, eventually acquired in 99 by the Yahoo people, and it got rebranded. But GeoCities offered, I think, something like 15 megabytes of web space for free. Steady on. 15 megabytes of free storage space for you to put up anything you liked. Everyone became a web developer suddenly. I'm going to take a moment here to show you a website. A redirect notice. What's it telling me about that? The previous page is, yeah, okay. That's where I want to go. Can you see the very clever and subtle use of colour?
Wider than the widest screen in time.
Yes, the navigation. This is Dan's page, by the way. This is
Page 97 in front page 2.
Okay.
That's the image map at the top with an image for navigation. There's no text.
Yeah. So there was no need to think of translation for these. We had the page was last updated on Thursday, the 1st of July, 1999. In actual fact, it was last updated last night when you uploaded it in game format. But some of the things that were really big at this time, there were page counters, so you could see how many other people had visited your lovely web page. And these page counters became, well, they became quite a thing. People would steal page count hits and start them at a high number so they felt better about their website and their page. Yeah, animated GIFs, we can see the beginning of this crazy animated GIF thing. The dog across the top, that adds so much to the navigation. Okay.
It was the in thing at the top.
So, now it's going to play. Oh, that works. Now we move on. We're going to leave GeoCities aside for a moment, but don't worry, we'll kind of come back to a little bit of GeoCities in a sec. Lycos. Lycos is actually still around. Lycos, believe it or not, is a web portal. Again, 1994, your personal internet guide. It went down in history in 96 as being the fastest ever IPO to inception offering in the NASDAQ history. And I think that's true even to this day. And I tried really, really hard to find out how quickly that was, and I was unable to do so. Thanks, Wikipedia.
We're at half an hour.
Speed it up.
Speed it up. I'll drop some of the. I'll just flip through some.
Big chunk of history.
Do you remember Alta Vista? It was cool because it had the first full text web search engine. Almost all of the searches up until then were just indexes. This was full text, so you could find out all the words that Dan used on his lovely page. I don't know whether you ever recognize Yahoo. Another company that seemed to not be too quite sure what it was going to be, eventually ended up as a portal. Some of the people in this room spent some time working on those portals.
Still looks like that.
It still looks like that to this day.
Still don't know.
There's, do you remember Ask Jeeves?
Yeah.
Still around. Ask.com's still big right now, but Ask Jeeves kind of was the first real natural language search query. So you could ask a nice question. As long as you put the word please on it, I think we'd be very happy with that one. Do you remember ICQ? I'm sure you all have used... You still use it?
Yes.
Still in use, I know.
And I still use it a bit with Russian friends.
There we are.
It's still quite big on the Russian communities.
Came from out of Israel. Was bought eventually by AOL. Want to talk about very briefly Babelfish. I couldn't get the original Babelfish. Babelfish allowed you to translate between languages, not just from one language to another, but between languages. It was pretty cool. They still offer this service. Unfortunately, it's no longer Babelfish. The URL points straight to Yahoo's search, and I think it's now powered by Bing, which is oh yeah, Babelfish, of course, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Yeah, got the reference to that one. Do you remember that? I'm just going to. I think I have to say okay again.
That's the stuff you just couldn't get off of your computer.
All right.
Oh, happy days.
Happy days, right? Everyone.
No more lines.
America Online. I don't have very much to say about America Online because I kind of thought you might know loads. I got Always Offline, a wonderful dial-up service that made it big in America and hit the internet and tried to rebrand itself as a portal. Funny that. MySpace, place for friends. Started up in 2003. Loads of music-y based things to that one. Still to this day is in existence. A place for friends. Do you remember Can You Forget? Now this is going to be just a quick breeze. Do you remember 1990 Godwin's Law? Do you remember the dancing baby? Okay.
Hey, go dancing baby.
I said I'd bring back some animated under constructions there. The hamster dance. Now I could flick out to the hamster dance with all of the sounds, but I think you get the idea. Animations, man. Bonsai Kitten.
Oh.
Bonsai Kitten.
No!
Bonsai Kitten, which you can't see there. All right, we've got no signal. All right. I talk about Bonsai Kitten. I'm going to talk about Crazy Frog. Bonsai Kitten. Crazy Frog, known as, Star Wars Kid. I won't go into any other, in showing you the movie, but this is a poor chap who pretty much, in my opinion, became the very first cyberbullying case that ended up in settling out of court in 2003. But basically, he videoed himself playing the whole Star Wars stuff, and some kids found the video and then put it online, and yeah, cyberbullying. It happened way back then too. The Crazy Frog, the annoying thing, became a massive big franchise, as I'm sure that you're aware. Ling's Cars? You guys familiar with Ling's Cars? I didn't want to trust having a proper link to the URL. Ling's Cars, this is a woman here in the UK who sells, and she's absolutely rich, and she's done it by doing ridiculous online stunts, selling her car leasing solutions around the UK. But if you could imagine every single thing on there bouncing around and flashing and blinking, that's Ling's Cars.
I do those cars. It's got the best paisley background you've ever seen.
Yeah, we're on the home straight now, I promise you. Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, Pastafarianism, really big thing, 2005. All happened because an American state wanted to start teaching creationism, and so this rights lawyer, I believe it was, wrote a letter stating, well, look, if you're going to spend time teaching creationism in schools, then you may as well teach about some crazy flying spaghetti monster, for all it means. Shortly afterwards, New Zealand and the Netherlands recognised the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster as a religion, and to this day we now have Pastafarianism as an option when you're filling out the census. ICANN has cheeseburger. Yeah, I thought we might put that in there. That was a much younger me. Oh hi from Oh hi. Oh hi. Cat videos, pretty much. I don't know whether you remember the Rickroll. Do you want to have a little bit of We weren't going to go for the Rickroll. Thank you. Just before I leave, do any of you have a device at home called a computer with maybe a 3.5-inch floppy drive still on it? Oh, over the back there? All right. Be very pleased to know I've got a 3.5-inch disc lock for you, which you can use to, if you'd like to pass that back.
You win.
Oh, I left the 5 1/4 at home. I was actually using the 5 1/4 myself. So thank you all, you've been a lovely audience. I'm sorry to have overrun a little bit. I hope you've enjoyed a little bit of a nostalgic look back.
Any quick questions?
Why?
It's important to know where we came from so we don't make the same mistakes again. Thank you very much.
Well,